So, we're off to the second video. I wanted to show you the book. I discovered, just to prove to you that I really like reading and looking at and making notes of. There's a lot more book than... Anyway, just wanted to prove to you that I'm actually reading the book. Not that that matters. But I did discover that there were a couple of other YouTube videos that are talking about this particular book and with the author. And I haven't looked at those yet because I figured what I'll do is I'll read all of this and we'll get to the end, and then once we get to the end, then we'll see how we compare to what the author says about his own work. So in the previous video, we discussed about the failure of meaning 1.0 and 2.0 and the cowardice of doomsday preppers. And maybe I didn't exactly use that word, but in my opinion, that's what doomsday preppers are. It doesn't matter what form they take, whether they're loading up stuff into their bunkers or planning escape to Mars. They're all running away from issues instead of confronting them. And yes, I recall telling you about how I planned to sit up on the roof of my mother's house in the event of a Russian ICBM coming to take out Tinker. But I'm not that boy anymore. So, the book has a short little beginning part to part one, which is Choose Your Own Apocalypse. And the first little part is called The Cinderella Story. Wheel says we must first take stock in our issues. Kurt Vonnegut, while a student at anthropology, said that there were only a handful of story types. And Wheel kind of pulls out and describes several of different types, but he focuses on the Cinderella story because that's the most compelling one, and it's the one that he's going to go with as the analogy for us. And the Cinderella story, the basic premise there, or not the premise, but the flow is your main character is down, and then they go up, and then they go really down, and then they go really up. And Wheel says that humanity itself is a Cinderella story. We started out as hunter-gatherers. And then we got culture and industrialization, and now it appears that we're shooting towards the really down part of our story, or potentially. And from that, we can either run and hide and lose, or stand up and fight and possibly win. Now, unlike a fairy tale, there's no prince that's going to fit a glass slipper on our foot. We have to take agency to get to the next stage. Now, when I read this part, I got sidetracked a little bit, thinking about the course of human events. We know that the earliest modern human lived about 300,000 years ago. That means that we found a skeleton that we can date to 300,000 years ago, and we know that it is a purely modern human. Human culture, as we know it, is about 10,000 years old. So, that means that humanity lived in a primitive form, like tribes of the Amazon or that island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Human beings have existed for 290,000 years in that hunter-gatherer phase. I made this completely worthless pie chart to visualize this. The whole pie is all of humanity since the oldest known fossil of Homo sapien. For 300,000 years that have been in the same brain and body that you and I have. So we don't know how people lived for the first 290,000 years, but we have an inkling for the next 10,000 years. So from 10,000 years until maybe 200 years ago, the majority of humans lived pretty miserable lives where they were serving some overlord or another. And then for the last 200, maybe we've gotten some of the benefits of the Enlightenment, some of us. And then we can count down to maybe the last 50 years or so where humans might have what we would call modern life, the things that we enjoy of our modern life, the electronics and indoor bathrooms and all that stuff. I mean, as a reminder, just a sliver of your own ancestry, my grandmother, my mom's mom, lived for a time in a sod house with a dirt floor. And my mother and father both grew up without indoor plumbing. And I guess that it's important to also remember that of the 8 billion people that live on this planet, somebody in those 8 billion live in all of those types of lives. I mean, you have everything from hunter-gatherers that are alive on this planet today to, somebody who has all the comforts. So that launches our first real chapter, the center. So first, Wheel talks about exponential everything. He starts out by discussing a conference that he attended in 2018 in Africa, talking about how to make Africa a better place, I guess. And some people were talking about the insurance, how to make sure that everybody has potable water and how to get electricity to everybody and other infrastructure type processes. As an aside, I was in a FAA meeting not too long ago where they were talking about some cool various different things, and one of the things they were talking about was this company that works in sub-Saharan Africa, and they use drones to deliver medication. And one pilot can basically fly 100 drones at a time. So what they're doing is they're delivering medicine via these drones to clinics and to individuals and to even the smallest little towns, or not towns, but settlements. And I think that's kind of cool. That's using technology in I think a good way, because they're providing some good things there. Wheel shares the quote, "We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies." So this first section really focuses on really our privilege. I can spend time making a video for free to share information about a book to my kids who live in different parts of a pretty big continent. My father was pretty savvy, but he could not even have fully imagined this privilege. So Wheel goes on to describe the chart that he created to describe the exponential change that we are experiencing. I attempted to recreate it. The blue line is the coming alive line, showing how science and technology is making life better. And the red line is the staying alive line, showing how climate change and geopolitical politics are degrading at a similar pace. And Wheel makes the suggestion that we're in the crosshairs, or we're at the intersection of those two lines. Now his graph didn't have any labels on it either, so it's just illustrating the point, I guess. The next section of the chapter is called The Oedipus Complex, a clever title. He starts with two iconic moments. The first is the fire at Notre Dame, saying that on some metaphorical level this represented the fall of the Catholic Church with scandals and such. The second being 9/11, which, as you know, is the not-so-metaphorical attack on Western economic power. Edifice can either be an imposing building or a system of beliefs, and Wheel is really using it multiple ways here. He goes on to describe the 2008 recession caused by the housing bubble, caused by banks and their predatory lending, and the folks that ended up using that to buy more house than they could buy. The simultaneous waning of confidence in neoliberalism and democracy is no coincidence or mere correlations. Neoliberalism has undermined democracy for 40 years. Growth has slowed. The fruits of that growth has gone to the very few at the top. I think it's important to remember the subtle difference between liberalism and neoliberalism, as they seem similar. And, we talk about this a lot. Neoliberalism is really what KB did a whole big long thing about this too, but neoliberalism is really what both parties are espousing at the moment. It's, in a way, we almost have a single party system with some distinct differences in action at the top. So Wheel continues the Oedipus complex to discuss internet companies and social media platforms. On the one hand, they don't want to be responsible for the content shared on their platforms, but they do want to profit from nefarious use of big data. This is going to be a big issue going forward in this book as well as in life. On the one hand, I agree that a platform shouldn't be held responsible for the content of users' posts any more than a telephone pole is responsible for what's said through the lines or what's stapled to its post itself. But I do have a problem with those networks profiting off of misinformation and intentional divisiveness. Ultimately, I feel that responsibility rests in the hands of bad actors, and to that end, I would advocate for the end of anonymity online, personally. My grandmother once told me that you should not say something at home that you wouldn't say on the street corner. And while that may be a bit much, I think there is a point. You're free to say whatever you want, but consequences are consequences. Will wraps up the Oedipus complex section, talking about Big Pharma and their role in the opiate crisis. He reports that 80% of heroin users today began using prescription medication. Obviously, there's a lot more in the book, but because he gave us a lot of different examples of various different things, but all trying to describe areas that are broken. And he continues. The next section is subtitled End of Faith. Will talks about how the Pew Research Corporation noted in 2015 that more people identified as none when asked what religion they practice. Not only was none the largest religion, but it's also the fastest growing. He says, while reasonable, you can tell I'm reading some of this. He says, while the reasonable have been stepping away from faith, others are pushed to one side or another, which he describes as fundamentalism or nihilism. So traditional religions are losing folks. The megachurches, with their rock and roll approach, are growing and teaching people to read the Bible literally, to have faith in what's basically a death cult. And I think it's good to remember the cynicism of the preachers as well. I believe the leaders of traditional faiths generally believed what they preached. I would even go so far as to say that Billy Graham believed what he preached. But most of the current breed, like Joel Osteen, are just in it for the fame and money. Nihilists, on the other hand, just give up. With no hope, there is no reason, no meaning. Will quotes a lot from Fight Club in this section. Will goes on to quote statistics regarding the number of people on anti-anxiety medication and how suicide is increasing. He also touches on Nietzsche, who famously declared God dead about a century ago. And what did Nietzsche really mean by that? So at the time, the Enlightenment thought was on the rise. Through science, we were learning how the universe works and how we as a species no longer needed to focus on a God to explain the unexplainable. So one could have faith in science, but that is shaky, as the whole purpose of science is to question the hypothesis. The chapter concludes by saying that mainline religion, meaning 1.0, collapsed, and secularism, meaning 2.0, was not enough to fill in the gaps. Ultimately, this chapter further describes the symptoms of the overall problem. My initial take on all of this is I can see where Will is going. 100 or so years ago, the certainty of God provided a foundation for most. My grandparents, my parents, to a certain extent. For some, science and rationality could take its place, but they could only do that while the actors were trustworthy. Once there was question about what they could trust in science, once science started to break its own rules, in essence, then that becomes less, well, trustworthy. And on top of that, you have you have the natural process of science, but then you also have the fact that there are bad actors that are putting distrust in science for people in general, right? And my initial take on this is I can see where Will is going. 100 or so years ago, the certainty of God provided a foundation for most. For some, science and rationality takes its place, but it can only do so if the actors are trustworthy, and people are not always trustworthy, either because they themselves are bad actors or because bad actors instill distrust in them, meaning either there are scientists that are out there that are lying, which that doesn't happen a tremendous lot, or you have somebody else coming in and saying that the science is a lie, which is what Donald Trump does with everything. Will is painting the picture that we are in that Cinderella story arc, and it's just now midnight on the night of the ball, and our coach has turned into a pumpkin. or is turning into a pumpkin. We'll call it that. Griffin and I just got off the phone, and we were talking about this kind of thing. And I don't know that we're going to know what the answer is. I don't know if this book is going to provide us any answers. I mean, it's not going to answer the question, because no book can do that. Not even the Bible can do that. The Bible couldn't do that 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago any better than it can today. And this book isn't going to either. What it's going to do is it's going to give us some suggestions, maybe. It's going to give us some direction or some ideas so that we can make our own forward motion. Anyway, this will be a continuingly interesting arrangement. I have read the next chapter as well, but I haven't marked it yet. So I will do that probably this week, and hopefully I'll get another one of these out sooner than